Novartis measures the social, environmental, and economic impacts of its business activities to understand what matters most to stakeholders and to society. Let's take a closer look at the significance of measuring GDP contribution for this approach. The concept of gross domestic product, GDP for short, is a well-established measure of the market value of goods and services produced by a country to satisfy the needs of end consumers. GDP has long been used to measure the economic performance as well as societal progress of nations. Ultimately, it defines a country's wealth. Its aggregate nature implies that it is possible to express how much an individual company contributes to the national wealth. One can take either of two approaches to measure GDP contribution. In the production approach, the difference between sales and cost are observed. In the income approach, profits, salaries, and depreciation yield GDP contribution. This, however, leads to a question. How are expenses for innovations, as well as research and development, integrated? In 2014, the OECD has introduced innovation as a driver of wealth into the systems of national accounts. Using a modified version of the income approach, it is now possible to express a company's GDP contribution from R&D. The GDP contribution from own business activities as well as from R&D constitute a company's direct GDP contribution, or direct gross value added, GVA for short. A company is part of an ecosystem. The goods and services that it procures in support of its business activities trigger a GDP contribution by its immediate suppliers, as well as by suppliers of suppliers, and so on. These activities and their GDP contributions occur along the entire value chain, all the way to the first step of mining, agriculture, and other services. The GDP contribution along the supply chain, Tier 1, all the way to Tier N, is called the indirect GDP contribution. Through salaries and wages paid in own operations and along the supply chain, consumption is enabled. Consumption is an important driver of GDP, and the enabled consumption through salaries and wages paid directly and indirectly is the induced GDP contribution. The sum of the direct, indirect, and induced GDP contribution results in the total GDP contribution. The economic measure of Novartis GDP contribution represents the financial impact in the social, environmental, and economic impact valuation.